I welcome all of you here this evening to one in the series of lectures that we are trying to have here at the Open Campus, at least to get UWI more in the eye of the public. We encourage as many people as possible, especially our past students of UWI and other persons who may be interested in presenting papers or lectures to us so that we can assist with helping with proper public discourse. This is one of the things that we need here in St. Lucia in an intellectual capacity. So we encourage you and other persons who may be interested. We want to, as much as possible, to encourage that kind of discourse. We need it here in St. Lucia.
I will speak to you about the militancy, defiance, and plain speaking of enslaved women in St. Lucia and the Caribbean. And according to the first speaker, it's a very ambitious topic, especially because of the fact there's very little material. So you really have to dig very deep for you to be able to produce anything that would be of interest to this audience tonight. Let me commence by thanking the UWI Open Campus, the St. Lucia Reparations Committee, Mrs. Deirdre Williams and Dr. Gregor Williams, for sharing their research and for encouraging me to write this lecture on what has turned out to be, for me, a eulogy for a group of people deserving of dignity, but who have remained nameless and invisible because of their gender and their race. This lecture is designed to give them name and character and to bring them to life. In the end, you will utter the name Petronile, Clotilde, and Kwashiba with great pride. Pride in the female founders of St. Lucia, those stiff-backed women mentioned in Omerous by Derek Walcott. I also wanted to do this presentation to underscore that there was a systematic approach of dehumanization of African women, which started in the 17th century, and which set the tone for the continued devaluation of women of African descent to this day. In an article entitled "The Manipulation of the Production and Reproduction of African Women in the Caribbean During Slavery," I argue that there were two phases in that dehumanizing process. The first treatment can be found within the homogeneous term chattel slavery, which referred to all the enslaved. In other words, there was no perceived distinction in the nature of African women and African men. The gender-neutral nature of the term denied African women their womanhood. No longer could they be portrayed as mother, nurturer, wife, sister, or lover. She was simply property. It attacked the reverence for the woman within her own culture and reduced her to the status of breeding wench and laborer. The second phase was the elevation of the white woman and later lighter-skinned women. Recall that during the early colonial period that upper-class women did not come to the West Indies. Most of those who came were from the lower classes. Some were criminals and others prostitutes. Some had come to seek their fortunes, while others had come in search of employment or marriage. However, soon, purification and ultimate deification was achieved through marriage to wealth and by removing them from the fields. These women would soon embody the persona of fragility and femininity. This was compared to the robust sexuality of the African woman with the childbearing hips and the full breasts. I argue that this concept would justify the continued rape of African women and their female offspring. The distinction between white women and black women was made clear in the case of rape. According to Alvin Thompson, the case of enslaved women was not registered, the rape of enslaved women was not registered as a crime. In fact, the definition of rape meant the rape of white women. He added that even when Trinidad, St. Lucia, and Berbice were acquired in the early 19th century, there was no mention of rape in the amelioration law. It would only appear in 1826 of the slave laws of Jamaica. This practice would be responsible for the notion of the cerebral white woman. It naturally followed. If the African woman was a physical being, then surely the white woman was the thinking human being. By the 1660s, as white women assumed the status of Mrs., African women became the symbol of physical, sexual, emotional, and other forms of exploitation. Although the recent detailed social history produced by Caribbean demographers and academic historians such as Vereen Shepard and Hilary Beckles has highlighted the oppression of women during slavery, there is still a major gap in the literature on the anti-slavery ideology of enslaved females in the smaller territories like St. Lucia. In conflict zones like St. Lucia, where there was perpetual war for centuries, how did these females, exploited both for their reproduction and production, and manipulated for the benefits of their owners or other males and females in the slave society, survive? I posit that their response was no different to the response of enslaved African men. They resisted through revolt, through marronage, through defiance, and through control over their fertility. They were just as militant in order to ensure their survival. Let me pause here to state that this paper is in no way intended to neglect the agony of the enslaved male or their centuries of resistance and war against oppression. Neither is it intended to diminish the suffering of poor white women in the society. This is intended to shed light on a specific group of persons who have been largely invisible in history. This view is supported by historians like Hilary Beckles, who reminds us in Persistent Rebels, Women and Anti-Slavery Activity that it remains necessary to highlight resistance practices that were common among women in order to redress their low history profile. Bell Hooks, in Ain't I a Woman, writes that scholars have been reluctant to discuss the oppression of black women during slavery because of an unwillingness to seriously examine the impact of sexist and racist oppression on their social status. She opines that while white men were exploited as laborers in the field, the black woman was exploited as a laborer in the field, a worker in the household, a breeder, and as an object of white male sexual assault. In other words, there was no one more exploited during slavery than a dark-skinned African woman. I make that specification because, except as punishment, white indentured women and lighter-skinned women were usually not considered as field hands. This is, of course, not to lessen the suffering of these women as domestics in the house or as nannies, for they were not automatically recipients of preferential treatment, and many suffered because of their constant proximity to the planters and their wives. Much of the St. Lucian history is written from the perspective of the colonizers. It is therefore not surprising that we know more about battles between the French and the English. You know, we have this little saying that we were fought over 14 times with great pride. And the wars waged on the Caribs by the white colonizers than any other aspect of our history. Further, it should be mentioned that generally, history concentrates on the activities of men. Noteworthy is the fact that the only comment of any significance of Carib women relates to their marriage to white French or English colonists. Otherwise, they simply belong to that poorly defined group of original inhabitants called Caribs. One can infer, however, that in this group, women held esteemed positions, as marriage by colonists to a Carib woman made the negotiations of peace an easier prospect. For example, in 1651, Governor Duparquet, having bought St. Lucia from the French West India Company, sent a French officer named de Rousselot to head a settlement building of the island. According to Reverend Father Charles Jessin Pepys into St. Lucia's past, having married a Carib woman, he was likely to be accepted by the Caribs of St. Lucia, and so it turned out. This nameless Carib woman would clearly begin the invisibility of women in St. Lucian history. Even though the early settlement of St. Lucia is marked by constant warfare, the plantation system began to take root. The signing of the Treaty of Shock on 14 January 1723 would bring some 40 years of consolidation of the plantation system, and women were part of this early frontier. Charles Jess writes that in this period, the French then had in the islands some 400 men fit to bear arms, and maybe 4 times that number of women and children. The literature suggests that the first sugar estate in St. Lucia was established in Vieux-Fort in 1765, and by 1772, there were 12,795 enslaved Africans on the island. No breakdown of gender is provided. One thing is clear: the enslaved took advantage of the wars between the French and the British to fight for their own freedom. During that time, the work of the estates was discontinued, the plantations were deserted, and according to British historian Breen, nothing prevailed but anarchy and terror. Once the French abolished slavery in St. Lucia in 1794, it was clear that the enslaved would fight both colonial powers to remain as freemen. During the French Revolution, they fought on the side of the French Republicans, but once they were defeated by the British in 1796, the freedmen joined the brigands, or the Armée Française de l'Ebois, and continued the fight against the British. They surrendered in 1797. The only conditions they made was that they would not be again reduced to slavery. These terms were accepted by the British. They were formed into a regiment which was sent to the coast of Africa, and Mr. Dixon, I'm so glad he's in the crowd, has said to me that he doubts that even happened because he suspected that they were sent to jail in England. St. Lucia would be returned to slavery under British rule until 1838. The 1834 slave register showed that there were 13,291 enslaved in the island at that time. Women were an integral part of the maroon societies in St. Lucia. During the period of the French Revolution and the ensuing brigand wars, they lived in the mountains and in the caves, raising crops and bearing children. According to Hampson, Ellis, and DeVoe, maroon women grew various crops, including cassava, corn, cucumber, dasheen, papaya, peppers, and you know the host of things that we like as St. Lucians, including my favorite sweet potatoes and tanya. They faced the same dangers as men, whether from the elements in dangerous territory, or from snakes and scorpions, and from the weapons of the British military, while at the same time caring for their makeshift homes and rearing their children. There is presently a great deficiency in the literature on female runaways in the Caribbean. The focus of the data is on male maroons, and with a few interjections on some female runaways. I argue in A Brief Respite, Female Runaways and Their Survival in the Caribbean, that one of the main reasons for this deficiency is the perception that volume is more important than the ways in which freedom was acquired and maintained. The fact is that no clear picture of the anti-slavery ideology of female runaways can be developed by a simple head count. Neither should a value be placed on petit marronage, in which more women participated, as opposed to grand marronage, in which more male slaves participated. Further, the data will show that men were facilitated in their bid for permanent freedom by many of the networks established by the female slaves. Clearly, the large number of men who escaped and the length of time they stayed away was very dependent on women, slaves and free, as well as white women who employed these slaves on their estates. Marronage was not simply running away. Rather, it involved a more complex process with established networks, which ultimately led to maroon societies in one island or the other. When women did not run away, they were facilitators in the process. Further, it is obvious that female slaves also attempted to stay away as long as possible. This was a difficult prospect because of the assumption within slave society that all black women were enslaved. It was easier for fairer-skinned women who could find employment in the urban areas. Women of all ages expressed their anti-slavery ideology by running away. No matter what the age of the female who escaped, planters suffered the loss, even if it was for a short time. Since the majority of females who escaped were in their prime childbearing years, as well as their prime productive years, the loss would have been felt twice as much. Young females rarely escaped alone. But there are advertised cases. There's the situation for a 12-year-old named Mary Catherine, who ran away from her owner, David DeLille of Grosley, St. Lucia. He indicated that she ran away on her own and was offering 4 goods for her return. All the women also participated in marronage. The supplement of the Gazette of St. Lucia on the 15th of December, 1789, had a published advertisement for La Negresse Zabette, native of Du Cap Vent, who was 45 years old. This female had escaped with her 21-year-old daughter. The owner was offering 132 livres for the mother and 66 for the daughter. It was obvious that this, for you to understand the value, one of these was a gold coin. So to offer 132 gold coins for the return of a 45-year-old female slave meant that she was very important to the estate. This was not an isolated case of older women running away, as older women had accumulated money through the sale of provisions and were well known to establish extensive networks which would aid in their escape and that of their children. There is evidence that during the French and Haitian revolutions, female slaves in neighboring French islands increased maritime marronage, as did female slaves from Barbados. Their destination was St. Lucia, where many remained in residence for many years. The Gazette and its various supplements of 1789 showed that many slaves from the neighboring islands were suspected to be in St. Lucia and vice versa. Planters from the French colonies recognized that female runaways would participate in maritime marronage. They therefore advertised in all of the various colonies. In many cases, these women remained free for many years. An example of someone who fitted all of these areas was a female slave from Martinique who escaped in January 1789. The first advertisement for her appeared in the papers 1 year later after her departure. It said that La Negresse Jeanette was a Creole of Saint Pierre who was 17 years old, and that she had escaped on foot. A subsequent advertisement published in May of that year listed her age as 25. Unfortunately, with the advent of the Haitian Revolution, the advertisement ceased, making it difficult to continue to trace this case. One of the most interesting cases of marriage, which I found, appeared in the Barbados Gazette, Saturday, 27th October, 1787. This advertisement was for a stout, well-made Negro wench, listen to the words, named Kwashiba, with a scar on her left hand. Harbored in around the Scotland district, frequently seen in Bridgetown, where she is well known. Her owner repeated these advertisements for the next 3 weeks, and then they stopped. No mention was made of this female for the next 2 years. This case becomes interesting when an advertisement from a jail in Castries, St. Lucia in 1789 revealed that they had in custody an African slave around 30 years of old who declared her name to be Kwashiba and said that she was from Barbados and St. Lucia, and she actually spoke English and a little bit of French. From this advertisement, it is obvious that Kwashiba had managed to elude capture in Barbados and was able to make her way to St. Lucia, where she resided in the Micoud area. Although there is no indication of the length of time she had spent in the island, the evidence suggests that for almost 2 years she had maintained her freedom. The fact that she was able to survive in an island where little English was spoken indicates her resourcefulness and anti-slavery ideology. She was determined to remain free and survive wherever she found refuge. Marriage as an act of defiance was usually met with severe punishment. The description of the various scars listed on the bodies of women attests to the brutality of the system and the attempted degradation through beatings and their eventual infirmity as they aged. As you go through the slave registers of St. Lucia, you will notice that you have a listing of women and men also. You see all of the names. And it is amazing to see the number, the identification marks. There are always scars around the belly, on the arms, on the face. So you understand that it was a very brutal system. And it didn't matter whether it was a man, a woman, or a child. So you can go to the archives and do that reading if you care to. It should be noted that there was no gender differences in the punishment of men and women on the plantations. Women were often subjected to whippings by male slave drivers or overseers. In the post-1820 period, there were attempts to improve these conditions, and in 1823, floggings of women became illegal. Before this period, however, all women, even if pregnant, were stripped and beaten publicly. Resistance and talk back. Stephen Small and James Walvin in African Resistance to Enslavement note that African women were more likely to resist by talking back to slave masters and overseers. All the husbands in the room know that. This is no doubt the case with Petronil on the Fordor estate in the district of Dennery. In 1833, Fordor was a functioning sugar estate, and St. Lucia was a British colony where slavery had been reintroduced. Petronil was one of those stiff-backed women who was aware of her rights. The story reports that on the morning of the 9th April 1833, her work was assigned for the day by the driver. His name was Père Solitaire, and he ordered her to dig cane holes. She indicated that she was not able to do so. He then assigned her to carry pitchettes. She refused to do so. Finally, because she complained of being sick, he told her to go to join the weak gang who were weeding. Following this order, she went to hide in the cane fields. Later, she was seen with a calabash of saltfish asking for some molasses. In the afternoon around 4:15, she was brought to Hardy Dupocage, the overseer, who instructed that she should be put in the pillory. She hung there all day by her neck and by her wrists while the sun blazed. When they came to release her, she was dead. It was reported that on 11th April, Petronille died of suffocation during punishment in the stocks as a result of punishment for her defiance and refusal to work. By this time, the amelioration period was in place. Therefore, the authorities were informed of the incident in a letter dated 12 April 1833. The letter read, "Yesterday afternoon, a female slave, the property of Hardy Dupocage, was strangled by having been placed in the pillory upon the Fodor estate in the quarter of Dennery." In the report of the examining magistrate for the 13th April, it became apparent that the reason for the punishment was refusal to work. That the deceased had not presented herself to work with the weak gang as she had been ordered to. Mr. Dupocage observed, "This Negro woman will not do anything for me." The verdict of the inquest was given as accidental death. Lucille Mathurin Meyer, in The Rebel Women in the British West Indies During Slavery, states that the most damaging thing which the slave could do was not work at all. One can therefore almost hear the defiance of Petronille in the estate manager's utterance. "This Negro woman will not do anything for me." The incident resulted in short-term unrest among the slaves on the Fodor plantation. Her death caused stirrings of revolt, so that the militia had to be sent to the Mabuya Valley to maintain order. The governor of St. Lucia took it sufficiently seriously to place the plantation under military supervision. On May 1st, 1833, he wrote to the Secretary of State in London as follows: "As this circumstance was reported to me to have created an excitement among the slaves, I judged it proper to send a military detachment to the estate, and I am happy in having to report that the excitement completely subsided in the course of the following day when the troops returned to their quarters." Petronille's death in this manner was instrumental in limiting the use of the field stock as an instrument of punishment for women. In 1833, the governor published a proclamation which sets limitations on the use of the pillory as punishment. In his proclamation, he stated that from the date of his presence, it shall not be lawful to apply any punishment therein mentioned to any such female slave, unless some person of free condition or two slaves, being neither concerned in authorizing or in the application of such punishment, but being competent to give evidence therein in a court of justice, be present at and witnessing the placing of such female slaves or slaves in the pillory, and unless such free man or one of such slaves as aforesaid shall remain to keep strict watch over such female slave or slaves, so punished during the whole time that she or they shall be subject to punishment. So the death of Petronille caused the reversal of the use of the stocks, except if there was somebody to watch over the person who was being punished all the time. This resistance inspired other women like Clotilde from the same estate. The records indicate that Clotilde was ordered by Mr. Dubocage, the estate manager, to go and cut grass for the horses on a Sunday. Clotilde knew her rights under the Code Noir and refused. Dubocage had her whipped. Clotilde, well-informed woman that she was, reported the matter to the stipendiary magistrates. And there was an investigation which favored her. By this time, women were daring to demand rights through the legal system and were starting to receive redress through this avenue. Throughout the West Indies, women were quick and loud in making complaints about their owners and overseers. For although most slaves could not read, they were often well informed about the slave laws of the colony and knew exactly what privileges and protections they were entitled to. If you look at the literature, in every West Indian colony, planters wrote about the sharp tongues and hot tempers of enslaved women. Mayer writes in 1825, the governor of Trinidad wrote to the colonial secretary about the insubordination and insolence of women and noted that 1,782 women, as compared to 941 men, had to be punished, and that confinement in the stocks cost valuable labor time. Despite these punishments, numerous slave women, in fact, showed little fear of their superiors and did not hesitate to answer back. I know that very well. My mother always naming our women. The slave registers, which were started in St. Lucia in 1814, give insights into the numbers of slaves on the plantations by gender, occupation, age, and family structure. Although these registers have been criticized for repetition and other inaccuracies and cannot be used for population statistics, they give insights into the activities undertaken and the role of women in these activities. It is also from these registers that we can start the naming of our female ancestors. Stiff-backed women who work on sugar, coffee, cotton plantations, and on provision grounds. So what is the value in the naming, especially when African names were removed at purchase or at baptism? Furthermore, surnames were a requirement from the colonial office, and planters met this requirement with disregard. According to Margot Thomas, some were named according to physical features. For example, Coffee Gauzier, because of the size of his eyes. Some planters gave the enslaved their names, and renaming was part of the seasoning process when every attempt was made to creolize them. Jerome Handler and Joan Jacoby, in Slave Names and Naming in Barbados, 1650 to 1830, write that sources for slave names in the West Indies include ads for runaways, letters from slave masters to foreign correspondents, plantation inventories, wills and deeds, and the slave registration returns. The information recorded in these sources is often minimal, usually only a slave's name and sometimes a specification of age and sex category, example, grown girl or old woman, and occupation were listed. Occasionally, the source indicates mother-child relationships, but there is rarely sufficient information for even a partial reconstruction of collateral and lineal kin. From the slave registers of St. Lucia, it is clear that the names had been creolized by 1817. The significance really is giving voice to the many women who labored primarily in the fields, but also in the houses, nurseries, and hospitals. Women whose names would never be uttered because, according to the Chinese saying, they gave their faces to the land and their backs to the sky. On the Beauséjour estate, 1816, we have Emily Fricot, a 47-year-old Creole slave who worked in the field, originally from Grenada. Valerie Fricot, who had a cut on her forehead, who worked in the field, was 20 and 4 feet 10 inches tall. 11-year-old Catherine Fricot, who was born in St. Lucia and who was a servant. Rosette Campbell, 65 years old, who was 4'10" and was infirm. She had 5 sons and 1 daughter named Amy Campbell, a 32-year-old who worked in the field alongside her brothers, ranging in age from 13 to 27. She had a scar on her leg. Mary Rose Ragnon, 27, field worker, whose 5-year-old daughter, Matrin, worked alongside her. 45-year-old African slave, Ursula Alepanese, who worked in the field alongside her family. The 81-year-old Fanny Lou Dileda, who still worked in the hospital, and Claire Coquette, 68, who was infirm but still worked in the field. On the Bois d'Orage estate, we have Margaret Marie Helena, 60 years old, and she was listed as an Igbo who worked in the field. Catherine Cassis, who worked in the field at 15 too. Marietta Popot, who cared for the children. She was 24 years old. Mary Rose Genevieve, who worked in the field. On the Bel Air estate in 1816, we have Constance Quiamba from Quiamba, 73 years old. Selimena Morat, an Igbo, 60 years old. Elizabeth Solo, 72, whose origin was simply listed as Africa. Katie Lindsay from the Congo, who was 35. Carolyn Murphy, 25, in 1819, also from the Congo. This particular plantation had a large number of slaves from Africa, and some of the ages suggest that they were bought after the end of the slave trade in 1807. On the Larry Seuss estate in 1816, Madeleine Seraphine, 10, and her 14-year-old sister Didi, who worked in the house and who by 1822 had a 2-month-old daughter named Rose Seraphine. On the Trumasse estate, Martha Marie Cato, 20, with crooked feet. Hortensia Dembas, a Mandingo with scars on her face. She was 60 and still worked in the fields in 1831. Jeanette L'Hopital, who was a 63-year-old Igbo. And guess her occupation? She was a nurse, hence her surname. On the Roseau estate, Mary Louise Alexander, 60 years old and a midwife. Alexandrine Alexander, 31 years old, deaf and dumb, who worked in the cane fields. By 1831, many of the female slaves from Africa were listed as invalid. 75-year-old Elizabeth Thistle from the Gold Coast, and 63-year-old Betty Zami listed as an Igbo. Women who may have been enslaved on plantations, but whose spirits were never broken. Hilary Beckles writes that many African women arrived in the West Indies with an anti-slavery consciousness already fostered by activist resistance to capture and sale. There is no doubt that in this respect, enslaved women in St. Lucia were no different from the enslaved in the rest of the West Indies. St. Lucia was, however, a very different slave society. It was in a constant state of war. And this must have kept that anti-slavery activism alive in St. Lucia, and would account for the perpetual spirit of resistance by enslaved women. During the wars, they spent most of their time as freed women, and there is no doubt that the defiance and militancy was more overt with the reimposition of slavery by the British. Small wonder that in the 21st century, our Nobel laureate can still speak to the old stiff-backed women of St. Lucia. Thank you.
And say thank you very, very much for being here with us this evening. I'm sure all of us thoroughly, well, I can hear that all of us thoroughly enjoyed it, and of course it's whetted our appetite, and I'm sure persons will be able to do perhaps a little more research on their own and see how they can add to what already has been done.